All right. Next up, we have PeerLedger. And this is Don Jutla, who's the founder and CEO based out of Halifax, Canada. PeerLedger uses cutting-edge blockchain technology to help companies collaborate to protect human rights, improve environmental performance, and significantly reduce key risks such as counterfeiting and safety in their supply chains. So y'all give it up for Don.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks to Brian and Lisa to give us an opportunity to chat with you. I'm actually no longer CEO. I'm president of the company. Our CEO is a world-famous cryptographer, and so we'll talk about him a little later. So I'm from the Northeast in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia. So you have a representative from, North and South and Singapore, etc. It's always great to be here in New York City. I used to spend, when I was growing up a long time ago, summers in New York City with my grandparents. And my father lived for 20 years in Singapore. And so, it's all good talking about these different geographies. In Nova Scotia, some of you may have taken the ferry across there. You know that it's very famous for its seafood, and you may have enjoyed some of that. So what we're doing here with PeerLedger, we're a blockchain company, and we're branded as a responsible sourcing company. The idea and the big problem behind it really is that executives get very little insight into the CSR, so the corporate social responsibility performance of their supply chain. And particularly, they may have access to the tier 1 visibility to that performance, but very few companies have access to tier 2, tier 3, and beyond. And so we set out to basically help solve this problem and help the executives be able to make brand promises and keep them. So Elisa this morning, when she presented Milena, talked about big consumer trends, talked about needing consumers wanting to have transparency, wanted to know where the ingredients of the, came from for the stuff that they make. And so basically what we do with our software is that we provide that level of transparency. And of course, the companies, they do, you ask yourself, well, do they care about this problem? Do they care about being able to easily make brand promises and to keep them? Do they care about having the transparency all the way back to the first mile to the areas, where they actually source these materials? And, we know that they're caring more and more about it because there's consumer pressure around it. Nielsen and a lot of the other companies have said so. And also, we're getting more regulation around responsible sourcing. So you have acts like the Modern Slavery Acts. Several countries have adopted these acts, like Britain and Australia, New Zealand. It's in front of Parliament in Switzerland and Canada. And so, we know too that, of course, that purpose drives profits. There's been a trend to have B Corp, and they certainly, as companies look at the sustainability of the world and so forth. And so it is difficult for many companies, and they would stand to lose quite a bit of money if, a child labor issue came up in their supply chain, or money laundering issue, etc. And so the technologies that we create basically is to help companies prevent those issues from happening and to be able to track the performance of their CSR across the depths of their supply chain. So, as I said, our solution basically it's positioned to help the executives to execute on those sustainability promises and be able to convert that into increasing revenue. And in the slide before, you may have seen the picture of $8.2 billion being spent in the UK on food that was ethically sourced. And so we know that companies are trying to use these technologies to position to gain more revenue. The other part is around the ability of the technologies to revolutionize speed and precision for the services where they may need to manage risk. And so they can also show, of course, their compliance pieces all that much better and more cheaply. And we know from the previous slide too and from the surveys that there's a 30% risk to have counterfeit components injected into supply chains. And so the other advantage of the technology is that we can flag and prevent the counterfeit materials from entering the supply chains in the first place. So in our software, what we did was we broke down the services that it can provide into 7 different pieces. And so we can track and trace over the entire supply chain. We have a bunch of different traceability transactions, not only registering the production of the materials and the shipping in and out and change of custody, receipt of custody, but also the transformations of the materials. So whether there are multiple inputs going into a process and multiple outputs, or single inputs, multiple outputs, single inputs, single output, or multiple inputs, single outputs, they're all being captured as you go through the supply chain. Also, in addition to that, the documents that are associated with events and transactions are being tracked through the supply chain too. So we do that track and trace over the entire supply chain for any type of materials. It can be food, it can be minerals, it can be clothing, fabric, what have you. The other piece that we worked on was around visualizing the supply chain. So you will see soon some of the graphics that we can put up within seconds. And of course, these are traces that would normally take people days or weeks to produce. And again, with the same issue that they're going across different spreadsheets and different ERP systems or different supply chain management systems that, of course, don't talk to each other. So it's part of the speed up that you get with technology. Then the other service we have is one around acting to manage risk. So one example of that service is a recall service where anyone who's handled a contaminated item in a supply chain can be identified. And so we can go forward, backward, and recursively in case those items have been put into other products as well to identify every single supplier who's touched a defective or contaminated item. And the fourth service, again, is around managing documents that may be associated with those transactions. We found that this was especially desirable in countries where there are high levels of fraud and where the companies needed to make sure that whatever they were seeing was actually backed with some sort of proof, some sort of accounting model. And the other advantage is, of course, a service where you can retrieve your transactions within seconds, thereby reducing internal audit costs as well as external audit costs in terms of putting the transactions and actually retrieving the transactions, because that's some of the time that's taken when your auditors are on site. Another one is around, of course, you're being able to prove that you've got responsibly sourced materials. So if there are marks that you're using on your products, you can justify and you can back up those claims because you have a trail to do so. And the other bit is around giving the consumers the visibility of who's handled every item inside of the supply chain. And so we created a public trace API, which could be integrated with consumer applications. So if you're a grocery store, and you have a consumer application or a retailer, JCPenney's or whoever, with a consumer app, we can integrate with that consumer app and show you the trace for whatever particular items that you might choose to show to your consumers that you know that they're responsibly sourced. So we've been working with one of the largest refiners in the world of precious metals metals, and I'll show you a little video. It has no voice, so I'll talk a little bit over it in terms of what we can do. They scan their products, so they refined gold bars. One of the things that they do. That's an example of one of their gold bars. They do beautiful designs on it. I think it's a Lady Fortuna 1 ounce bar that you're seeing there. And they've got a consumer app in the Apple Store that you can use, and you can scan it, and it will tell you whether your gold bar is authentic. So that's their technology. And then we integrated with that to show the provenance of that gold bar. And I'll show you a little bit of what it looks like. So Veriscan is the name of their authentication technology. And they've got a special technology to change the dye so in such a way that when the gold is poured, it's poured in concentric circles. And so there's a fingerprint that is made that's unique to every gold bar. And so here's Veriscan saying that it's authentic. Then the provenance button is being pressed, and this is where our technology comes in. And it shows the entire trace that the gold bar was gotten, the gold doré for the bar was gotten from the left-hand side from Newmont Ahafo mine, and then it went to a logistics provider. Then it went to Pump, which is a refinery. And then in Pump itself, what you're seeing is that we can drill down on our visuals, and so you can see the process inside of the refinery. So you can see, in that case, it went through 3 different runs, and the resulting product went into the little tiny 1 ounce bar that you saw, right? And so with it, we have transactional information. So transactional information like, how much, what quantity came, what was the assay of the materials that came across, when was the material produced, and so forth. So anything that's of interest internally in those events, you can get from those graphs. And of course, what you're seeing here in the application in precious metals, we can do it in other industries as well. So we can do it for food. So if you wanted to see, where your beans were being made, you can scan a QR code on a smart packaging, and you can get the same sort of visual all the way through. And the next thing that you could imagine are clever marketers, so today's marketers, maybe another drill down telling a little story about, Bob and Sue who grew the coffee cherries in a particular spot, etc. And so it could be a tool for marketers as well. With the pricing, we have a sort of unique pricing model. We price per SKU, and so we give even large companies access to experiment with responsible sourcing technology like this. They can track, for example, or do a pilot to track a particular item for $500 a month, which is a very affordable entry point for most companies. The other piece, of course, is that there's a lot of people offering, or a lot of companies offering blockchain technology out there, and people say to me, why are we different? What do we do differently? And so one of the things we do differently is around the way we bundle our services for a product. So, for example, we can do certification and inspections and almost anything that you can think about with that same product. In terms of tracking the information through, as long as it's something that's trackable and you want to track. So we create a user-composable blockchain transactions, so the company themselves can define those transactions, and that gives a whole lot of flexibility. So that's one way we're quite different. And I mentioned the bundling as well. Because minerals is our beachhead, that integration with the authentication technology is also special for the precious metals world. And so I should say to you too that a lot of the end consumers are the high-end luxury goods companies. So if you have a brand who've said, well, I just want to buy artisanal gold, for example, and use that in my products because I care about the livelihood of 100 million artisans, and so I want my purchasing dollars to go towards them in some way to make maybe Africa stronger or places in India stronger, etc. Then being able to control that supply chain in such a way that you know that the materials are not being commingled, that you don't have just 10% of your materials responsibly sourced, but you're saying, hey, most of my materials are sourced, and that there's no commingling. It means that processors in the middle, need to also support technologies like this in the sense that they may need to segregate in the case of refiners, their lines. In the case of food processors, probably do binning so that they're not mixing responsibly sourced product or ingredients with conventionally sourced ingredients too. And so that, that's where you may get slowed down, or that's where, yes, you have the potential to disrupt and change industries, because it's not just the technology driving it, but also the businesses wanting to do the right thing around responsible sourcing and the attendance impact on people and place and planet, as we've heard today. So we're a 14 employee strong company, and as I said to you before, we're in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We've been very dedicated to this problem from the first, probably the first company in the world to do it, and it was driven from a real problem that one of the Canadian banks had, and again around not having the executive insight into their supply chains. And so, in many of these businesses, their survivability may depend on having this kind of transparency into their supply chains. And so it was a labor of one that had meaning. And so Brian said to us, well, tell us, what does it mean to have use your technology? And so really we're going from 94% of executives not being able to have that transparency all through their supply chain to they're having it, right? So we can bring almost 100% transparency with the adoption of technology like this. It's possible for them to use track and trace technology to increase revenue when they're talking about doing ethical sourcing or responsible sourcing to their consumers. This is something that has been proven out in surveys as well. You would have seen on my second slide where one of the early applications with Carrefour, basically they were seeing that consumers were actually buying more of the blockchain tracked stuff than the non-blockchain tracked items that they put on their blockchain. And of course, you save a lot of cost if you can avoid risk and the time wasted in mitigating those risks or cleaning up after those risks. So we've seen where you can do 10,000 times speed up in terms of actually getting those traces out as well. And so there are lots of advantages to using technology like this. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take questions.
Any questions from anyone? Or I have a question. It seems to be more oriented towards like luxury items. I mean, have you seen any uptake from any items or companies that are closer to like the commodity spectrum?
So we're talking to a soft commodity.
Microphone?
Sorry, yeah. So we actually are talking to a soft commodity company right now dealing in cereals. And so yes, there is interest. And again, it's about being able to prove where you're getting your stuff from. So again, to be able to increase sales, you can say with some surety it's coming from this part of the world or another part or a particular farm, etc. Yeah.
Do you have any challenges getting players earlier in the steps of the supply chain to actually do the tracking behavior?
Yeah. So yes and no. Well, the first challenge with most blockchains are is actually in creating the network to start with. And so what we found is that sometimes it's easier to do a smaller piece of the value chain, prove that out, and then incrementally bring others onto it as well. But what it means, you see, there are trade-offs in doing that, because what it means is that the few that are on the value chain, they tend to customize what sort of information will be shared. So they have the particular data sharing, and then it affects the smart contracts that are being used, right? Because you have certain policies. If you have all of them at first, the trade-off there is that then it takes a long time to get everybody in. And then you've got this long debate and negotiation about what kind of data is going to be shared again and all those sharing agreements. But once you have that in place, it's easier. So there are different approaches to tackle bringing people onto blockchains. Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah, if I could just go a little step deeper with that. So let's say we've got a company on board and they're making some metal jewelry product, but they've got like 25 employees kind of making different steps.
Sorry?
So let's say I'm not sure this is working.
Yeah.
Let's say they've got like 25 employees each doing different thing in conversion and production and packaging or what have you. What is the exact mechanism that they use to input their process that it's in? Is it into a terminal? Is it into a wanding a device? Is it a handheld? And is there a way to standardize that to increase adoption and make it very easy?
Yeah, so we have 3 ways to interact with our system. We've got a mobile app. We've got APIs. So if they're actually putting that data into existing systems, so SEM systems or PLM systems or ERPs, we can take the data out that we need, and it's lightweight touches. And we also have a web portal, so a SaaS piece where they can put it in if they don't. Like if they're using spreadsheets, well, they can use our portal instead.
I think we have time. Is anyone who's keeping time? Do we have time for some more questions? Or?
Yeah, one more question.
One more question. I believe there's a question here, and or not anymore.
She answered it.
Oh, she answered it. Okay, in the back.
Sorry.
So in terms of the stage where they're actually collecting that, where they're collecting like the data about the actual gold bar itself, is there like a hardware component involved? And what is that hardware component exactly? And is that your technology, or how does it interface with your technology?
So no, it's all software to capture the information all the way through. And to answer your question too, we're not only at the luxury goods end, we're actually at the first mile too. So we have artisans and traders onto the platform, and so we track it all the way through to the processor, and in this case, refiner, and they may sell to banks, high-end luxury goods dealers, automotive industry, etc.
But my question was about that digital imprint, that digital fingerprint that is first created.
So that one for the authentication is their technology, and most of the blockchain companies partner with other companies for authentication technology. Because different materials have different authentication technologies. So in food, DNA testing is very popular, and so they're specialists in that area, and we would partner with them. We'd bring in their technology, use it, and then there'd be an extra control. One of the controls around counterfeiting too is the fact that something is registered on the blockchain, and if you're trying to put new materials in that haven't been registered by someone, some party inside there, that's a control for counterfeiting too. And then the other control is if we put authentication technologies around it too. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dawn, everybody.